Let's start to explore the topic of how we write up our results. So, the first piece to this is many of you are probably familiar with APA style. You've probably heard of it, particularly in high school or college, and you looked at it as a way to do references and about the in-text citations and how we format our references. You should be aware that style is not just about references. It also describes how we create our tables and figures and how we label them. It talks about headings. It talks about how we use pronouns. It talks about writing style. There's a lot of information in APA style. There's a link here to apastyle.apa.org, which is a great place to go. If you want to, you can purchase the APA style book. But there's a lot of stuff online from APA and other sources about how APA style works. I'd also particularly recommend the APA style blog. These are a number of people who blog on behalf of APA and answer user questions about style. I find a lot of great information in there. And APA offers various instructional aids such as webinars, handouts and guides, and sample papers where you can become more familiar with writing up your results in APA style. One of the key things to know about APA is the idea of describing the sample. It's really important when we're communicating about what we did that we communicate about the sample we used. We always want to include the number of participants we had in any particular study and how we recruited them and how we decided who was and who was not going to be part of that sample, particularly if any groups were excluded. This helps any reader to understand the generalizability of your results. You should also include some basic demographic information. Often we want to include, first of all, any general characteristics that were common. Our sample, for example, our sample involved older adults, Ford mechanics, psychiatric patients, students at a particular university, etc. We also generally include age, gender, and race as a way to describe our sample. But I would say in this, you really only want to include what's going to be relevant to your study. And if there's any additional things that are relevant, you should include those as well. So none of what I've said here is really a concrete guide. It's more of a loose idea about what you should include. You'll want to include specific demographics when they're relevant, right along those same lines: income levels, profession, relationship statuses, etc., as they help the reader to understand what exactly you did. Here's an example from the APA sample student paper that you can find online. Participants in this study included 75 Loyola University New Orleans students. Participants included 41 females and 34 males between the ages of 18 and 23. All participants in this study were volunteers. Some participants were recruited from the Psychology Human Participants Pool by signing up on a sheet posted on the psychology board and by convenient sampling. This gives the reader a very good idea of who were the participants in the sample. We know the basic split between genders, we know their general ages, and we know how these people came to be part of the sample. Here's an example from a paper by Nishi and Meyer on inclusive leadership. And this is an interesting one too, right? So they tested hypotheses using employees nested in departments at a large supermarket chain. They actually had 4,500 respondents, which is huge. And that only represents a 40% response rate. So they were able to, it looks like, sample an entire grocery store chain. They assured their response of confidentiality, and they arranged for all, and this is how they did it, right? It's that they had the responses sent directly to the research team. They talk in here in terms of percentages, the percentages by gender and race. And then they bin the ages. Instead of talking about a mean age or the range of ages, they talk about bins of ages. And why do they do that? Well, 10% were under 18, 20%-ish were between 18 and 22, another 10% between 23 and 29, 17% between 30 and 39, and then 41% older than 40, right? So if you actually were going to line this up into a histogram, you'd see that this is kind of a bimodal distribution of age. So just describing the mean wouldn't really get that information across. So this is worth taking a look at a different way to describe the data here. And then they talk about they were looking at departmental tenure. So it was important that they include departmental tenure in this. So that was an important part of their study. And then they talked about, when they excluded certain ones, right? So if there was a department that that had less than 5 respondents. They excluded those answers from their overall survey. And so they talk about their departments that they surveyed and how many respondents they had from each. So again, this is just a way to describe the data. And this is an important thing that you should think about when you're actually creating your results, is you need to describe your data set and the sample population from which your data comes. Here's another example from Weiss and Ritter that describes a sample. Right, and here they include standard deviations and they include means, right? They call it the average here, but they include the mean. So this is another way that relies more on our typical statistical methods for describing a sample. I also want to talk about, beyond describing the sample, we're going to talk about the statistical sentence. Now, I'm just introducing this topic right now. It's one that we will return to when you look at how to write up the results of any particular analytical outcome. So I just talked about how to describe the sample. The statistical sentence refers to how we describe our analysis and our conclusions from that analysis. It's important that any statistical sentence, any write-up of our results, conveys our conclusions, the descriptive statistics that suggested our conclusions, and the analysis of the data that affirms our conclusion. So let me show an example here talking about the one sample t-test. Here's an example of a sentence. The students in a Kaplan prep class that had a mean score of 112 and a standard deviation of 15 scored significantly higher on the math achievement test than on the population average. And here mu represents the population average. When we use Greek letters, we're talking about population parameters. When we use the letters M, English letters M and SD, we are talking about the sample. And then it describes T with the degrees of freedom of 99 equals 8, P less than 0.001. Now, I'm not going to get into how we do a one sample t-test here. I just want to focus on the way we're describing our results. Note here that we talk about our conclusion, that these students scored significantly higher on the math achievement test than the population average. And then we talk about the descriptive statistics that suggested our conclusion to begin with, right? That our mean of the sample was different from, and in this case, higher than, the population average. And then we conclude by including the analysis of the data. So in this case, the results of our t-test that affirmed our conclusion. So altogether, we have conveyed our conclusion, we've conveyed the descriptive statistics that support our conclusion, and then we've conveyed the statistical analysis that affirms our conclusion. Here's another way to do it, the confidence interval of the mean. Again, we'll learn about confidence intervals, we'll learn about t-tests, but I really just want to get this idea across that we have to write up on our results in a way that people can understand what our conclusions were, why we came to those conclusions and what they mean, and then the statistical analyses that support those conclusions. That's the essence of the statistical sentence and the essence of our ability to communicate about our data analysis.